Hello. Welcome to the Making of Sleepy Little Sailor podcast, episode 4. We are going to wait a little bit. I have the lovely Joel Anderson here, and we're going to wait a little bit and see if anybody's going to watch us live. It's so thrilling. How are you, Joel?
Well, my end, I've got some internet problems here that are just...
Don't believe that. With Colin, it did happen a lot.
It did.
Yeah, but I didn't mention it. It's sort of like when someone has a stutter. You don't really talk about it. You just you know what they're gonna say, and then you
I'm just gonna quickly reset my router.
So, yeah, Joel Anderson, he's in an undisclosed location in the Niagara area. And
the region.
The
Niagara
region.
Yeah.
Which is where there's a
region.
lot of wine. That's why he moved there. He moved there he moved further and further away from Toronto because he's a Westerner and he needs to go west and south. And he loves Americans, so he's got to go closer and closer.
I'm 30 miles from the border.
That's amazing.
Yeah. When the Civil War starts, we're going to go to Niagara in the lake and watch it across the river.
That would be amazing.
From our safe location.
How many times do you guys go to Niagara Falls? Do you ever go to Niagara Falls to see the falls?
We've been here 9 years, and we finally went probably 4 years ago. Got on the, it's not the Maid of the Mist anymore. There's a competitor. So you get on the competitor's boat because it gets closer. And took Claire. She was 7 years old or 8 or 9.
Yeah.
And I got to say, it was cool. I mean, we go to Niagara Falls. Yeah. But it's also kind of trashy. It's got this great, Clifton Hill is kind of a past its best playground for adults and kids. So Claire and I go there. We've been there a few times just where there's a day and I want to blow $100 watching her hit fluorescent golf balls in a fluorescent dark. There's all these weird. It's weird, right? And
you know what
but
the
it's fun.
best thing is? The wax museum is the worst representation.
It's horrific.
And that's what makes it so excellent.
That's what's so excellent.
Like their faces have started to melt or something. First of all, they didn't look like the people at all.
No,
Then the wax is melting.
Yeah, it's really bad.
It's so funny.
But the falls will always remain spectacular. So you walk down there and you just see it from the side and you go, I can see why they built a world around this. This is cool.
Yeah, I love going to the American side because it's actually quite beautiful. It's a state park and it's a lot nicer.
It is,
the Canadian side. Yeah, it's really funny. It's like you'd think that was, but what I realized, or what my theory is that the Canadian side is trashy because they're appealing to the Americans, and then the American side is beautiful and peaceful and pastoral, and it's appealing to the Canadians and the Europeans.
The only reason we go to Niagara Falls, US, is to go to the Home Depot and see if we can get some real weed and feed for the lawn, because in Ontario you can't get anything effective to kill weeds because that's how we're trying to preserve our groundwater. I mean, our water, I guess. So you go to America and but last time we tried it, we got busted at the border. The guy's like, what'd you guys buy? We said, we bought a lamp and let's see your receipt. You don't have weed and feed back there, do you?
Oh my God, that's
yes,
hilarious.
We do. Don't do it again. I'll let you through this one time. And we had a great lawn that year. That was about 6 years ago. I've had a shitty lawn ever since. Yeah.
I'm glad you have a shitty lawn. That means you're being better to the earth.
We live in a forest, so I have 30 some trees on our little half acre, and they suck all the life out of the soil. So the grass does not stand a chance. Also, Font Hill, where I live, is a hill. It's a sand hill. It's called a kame, a glacial kame. So when it rains, the water quickly bypasses your thirsty grass, goes into the sand, and then goes to the center of the earth. never to help your lawn
Goes to
again.
Beelzebub.
Yes. So it's this, the sand keeps it, so your basement will never flood, but your lawn will never survive.
I love that you got caught at the border with weed and feed.
Weed
Not
and
with
feed.
weed, just weed and feed.
Weed and
Weed
feed.
in feed.
Yep.
Okay, so some people are here, so I'm going to start. 'Cause,
Okay.
enough of this stupid chit chat about lawns and other. I actually do swear. I was shocked. Oh, someone does. Alan is commenting. I was shocked how it was casinos when I went to Niagara from the UK. See, Alan, you should have gone to the American side because it's so beautiful there. Anyway, so I'm going to do a little intro for my dear friend Joel. Joel Anderson is one of those drummers who pretty much always has a smile on his face, both on stage and off. He plays the role of just the dumb drummer, but watch out because his musical skill and knowledge are deep. And while you think he's just coasting along in his happy cloud, he's watching everything with an eagle eye and recording it in his sharp brain, later to be told in a hilariously tragic story. Equally a cynic and an optimist, Joel is a delight to hang out with and play music with, always saying the funniest things just when everything seems to be falling apart. One of my best memories of Joel is listening to him and Jim Bryson improv comedy routines while driving almost nonstop from Calgary to Montreal. Our van was broken into and it had to be repaired before we could drive it. So that left us only 2 days to drive about 3,600 kilometers. And we actually made it to the show on time thanks to Joel's ability to drive and joke and drive some more.
I drove the whole tour.
You drove that. Oh my God, you're amazing. At that Montreal gig, I was so fried that
Now,
at the
wasn't that
end of it, I
Kingston?
poured well, we did a Kingston show. You're right. We had to get to Kingston, but the last gig, it was Kingston. Then we went to Wakefield, I think. And then we went to Montreal. And the last show, Montreal, I was fried, so burnt out from this crazy thing because there was more backstory to it that I got all like raunchy at the very last minute and I poured all this beer on my head and I screamed out the last song. And meanwhile, Joel, of course, was smiling the whole time behind me. That was an excellent gig. And then I went home to the hotel and Cam actually joined us on that little 3-day run just to hang out. And I got in the bath and I had my makeup on still and everything, and I went in the bath and I just started crying and crying. But anyway, what was so wonderful was how Joel is like a machine of positive attitude, but at the same time not annoying because he acknowledges the shit that's happening.
Oh, yeah.
And makes a joke out of it. So Joel has worked with Jim Cuddy, Kathleen Edwards, Sky Diggers, Laurie Yates, Patricia Conroy Band, Leslie Spit Trio, and he's based in Southern Ontario, but he's originally a Westerner hailing from Calgary, Alberta, where he started playing music as a teenager, I think, and started a new wave band called Neo A4. Okay, Joel, explain. What is Neo A4? Where did you come up with that?
Well, I was in a cover band right out of high school in Alberta, and sometimes would venture into BC. And it was back when you could still do 6-night-a-week gigs in hotels and play. That was a really good school because you played 24 sets a week, and you lived in these hotel rooms and traveled on Sundays to the next town. And I did that for not too long, but long enough that I realized I didn't want that to be my life, but it was a really good training. So then we said, we've got to do an original band. I had a childhood friend and then a guy from another Alberta cover band from up in Edmonton who also wanted to do original music. So I moved to Edmonton and the three of us started this band called Neo A4. And we tried to sort of reinvent music as you would do in 1981 and try to create sort of a
1981.
We formed the band in 81.
Wow.
And And the name, we were all reading esoteric, mystical literature. Like we're into Gurdjieff and P.D. Ouspensky and J.G. Bennett and writers that were talking about the fourth dimension and extra dimensions, all this very interesting stuff. G.I. Gurdjieff was actually a Russian philosopher and mystic, and P.D. Ouspensky was his disciple who was coming at it more from a mathematician's angle. Anyways, and also smoking probably too much weed, and we would get together and discuss these mystical concepts, these esoteric concepts, which is not completely foreign to rock and roll. People like Peter Gabriel, Robert Fripp, Bowie, some of those people that were heroes to us were into some of these same things. That's kind of where we got a lot of this from. And so the name Neo A4, Neo, of course, just means new. And the A4, originally, when we formed the band, the A to the A4 was actually A to the fourth power. Ooh. Which was basically an expression of the fourth dimension. You know, we're trying to break through our three dimension. Basically, it was kind of like a prog. It was prog music, except that we were deeply influenced by the Clash and by punk rock, and then the post-punk bands like Gang of Four, Simple Minds, Psychedelic Furs, kind of those post-new wave, late new wave bands of the early 80s. We were, of course, we were really into Costello and the Pretenders and the Police and the Jam and all that. But at the same time, we were really into King Crimson and free jazz, a lot of free, really outside jazz, John Coltrane's later stuff, and Anthony Braxton. And so when we were just making up our own, we wrote for probably a year and a half before we played a gig. We just wrote all this music that was based on jams. A lot of it was on time signatures, but the songs had to be 3 or 4 minute pop songs because we didn't want the excesses of prog rock, because we were into the Clash and we were into the idea of kind of harder hitting short songs, but you had to express a million ideas. Basically, our band could clear a room in under 15 minutes. We played.
Yeah, well, I mean, you were in Edmonton, which was a little more artsy than Calgary.
Definitely. Back then,
Calgary is a lot more hip. But yeah, tell me about that, Calgary versus Edmonton. Why did you guys have to go to Edmonton?
One member of the band, the main singer, and I'd say the principal songwriter, although we all wrote, he was already living in Edmonton. He had no interest in moving to Calgary. The other member of our trio, who I had grown up to a certain degree with in Calgary, he moved to Edmonton to go to the great school, Grant MacEwan Community College, which had a great jazz program. So he moved to Edmonton, lived with his folks while he was at school. I was the lone guy left in Calgary. So they said, you have to move here. And to be honest, in the late 70s, when I was in high school, Edmonton was always the bigger feeling city. Calgary was still a large town full of cowboys, a lot of pickup trucks. It had wealth from the oil business, but Edmonton had the bigger university. It had a ballet. It had a symphony. It had all the accoutrement of a real city, of a Toronto or even, let's say, a Winnipeg. And so to move to Edmonton, and put it this way, when my cover band abandoned our Led Zeppelin, Queen, Aerosmith set list, fired our lead singer and became a new wave band, cut our hair off, and started playing the Clash, the Pretenders, the Police, Elvis Costello, we had shit thrown at us in the bars of Calgary. We were hated. But when we went to Edmonton, punk rockers would come out, or the Edmonton version of punk rockers would come out to the hotel where we were playing and actually sit there and go, finally, somebody playing at least some new wave. And Edmonton seemed quite far ahead of Calgary in 19 79, 80, in terms of it being more of an accepting city to music that just wasn't 70s heartland rock. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure.
Calgary was definitely behind Edmonton culturally at that point. Now, I think the rest of the 80s and the 90s, Calgary became the wealthier city, and the world found Calgary, and a lot more people from all over the world went there, and the city became a far more international city. They say.
They say, but it's still the Cowboys.
It'll always be Cowtown to me because I grew up there.
What is funny to me is that I know a lot of alternative people there, or alternative, but what's so cute is that even though it really appeals to me, Calgary, even though, because it has the guys with the, you drive at 45 minutes, and I did a gig there once solo, and these farmers with the huge rancher dudes with the big, like really old grandpa type guys, like not just the redneck young people who are trying to be pretending to be new country stars or something, but it's like, it's got that, it's super friendly, but it has this redneck thing. But then the people I know there are lesbians and artists and theater people, and they happen to all, so I actually really love the contrast of it and the people there, and everyone has to have a sense of humor if they're going to live there to deal with the redneck.
I agree. When I was there, the people that are trying to into something a little different off the mainstream will always find themselves in whatever city. Mm-hmm. And that scene, I had found the other person like that in Calgary. No, I mean, we had our little circle. But when we went to Edmonton, there would be a lot of people that we met that we found were like-minded. So to start our band up there made more sense. But to be honest, the whole time we were there, it was, how do we get a record deal, and how do we get to Toronto or New York or London? We weren't the typical prairie band that wanted to get to Vancouver or get to LA. We always looked east. And when we finally we got a record deal, it took us forever. It took us like 5 years to score a record deal. We signed with a Toronto label, and we all moved to Toronto. So when the band broke up a few years later, the other members went back west. I'd met my first wife, and I'd also met all these musicians, and I'm like, I can't go back to the prairies. I belong here, and I've never returned. I love Toronto as a city. I'm not there in the city anymore, but Southern Ontario, it really has felt like home for me, and I've been there far longer than I was ever out west. And I go west now, and I enjoy the memories I have, but I love it here. And I'd like to go even far. I love New York, and I love going to London, England. It just seems like when I go, the farther east I go, the more interesting it seems. Like
what's funny to me listening to you about that is that so you were playing new wave, and then somewhere along the lines you started playing more roots-based music. I mean, although some of the things you're mentioning, some of the influences you're mentioning aren't too far away from roots music, but you start playing this more rootsy music that might be more associated with somewhere like Calgary, or it sort of dreams of, it harkens to the country side and the ranch cowboy thing, and but yet you're in Toronto. But that's the funny thing about Toronto. It's got this kind of romanticization of that landscape and music.
Exactly. I was a young street cowboy.
Yeah.
Like a young street cowboy. I know, because when I was growing up, if I heard country music coming out of a radio, it was probably from a pickup truck of a guy who was in town for the weekend looking to beat up a guy like me.
Right.
I hated country music. I thought it was the only country music I liked was the AM radio pop country of the early 70s, like Lynn Anderson's Rose Garden or Charlie Pride's Most Beautiful Girl in the World, like stuff that would be on my AM radio side by side with the Stampeders doing Wild Eyes, or but the real country music, I was like, I don't have time for country music. I'm a rock and roller. And once I got to Toronto and my new wave band broke up, I remember towards the end of that band really burning out on the musical technology needed to keep up in the 80s. The sort of the 80s synthesizer drum machine arms race was incredibly fatiguing to me because I would be the guy running the VCR that was running the F1 and then running the MIDI programs and we had to run MIDI cables so my Octopad could talk to the keyboard, which could talk to his guitar pedals to put the echo of the guitars in time with the pre-programmed synth parts that I would stop and start. By the time the 80s were winding down, I remember thinking to myself, I wish I could be in a band that was totally organic, it had rootsy, not country so much, but the roots of music, either bluesy or country influences, still rocked, still was guitar based, still are pop songs, but there's no synthesizer or any gloss on them. And around that time, Blue Rodeo were beginning their ascent in the Toronto scene, and I'd hear about them. My first wife was friends with Jim's sister and knew that whole scene, and she'd say, you know, you should just go to Queen Street and see Blue Rodeo. They're basically they are the band that you are talking about wanting to be in. Now, 100 years later, I ended up in Jim's band, and I did play for Blue Rodeo one time as a sub for Glenn. But I remember that time around 1989, 1990 going, I'm so burnt on learning the newest sequencer program to run, and also, you'll love this story. I'm walking down the street, down Bloor Street, and I've got really bad hair at that point. I've got sort of my Tom Petty hair, which was straight. I had very straight hair, shoulder length. And I was wearing my Young Street Cowboy Master John boots, which are cowboy boots, but with velvet uppers. And remember the boot junk, the buckles, and all the crap you'd hang on your boots? And I've got a singlet on, and I'm 6'4", 125, sort of the skinniest non-junkie in North America at that point, walking down the street with the Tom Petty hair, the singlet, the boot junk, and some guy drives by and goes, out of style, man, out of style.
Oh my God. What did he look like?
I looked like
Could you even see? No, what did the guy that was yelling
he just kept going down Bloor Street. And I was like, am I pissed off? Does that hurt? And then I thought, no, you know what it is? It's that I'm trying to fit into the Toronto groove, which at that point really was a bunch of guys that looked like they just got fired from In Excess. That was kind of the look of 1989 Toronto band members. But Blue Rodeo would wear just cowboy shirts and jeans, and they were authentic in their. It wasn't fashion cowboy wear. It was thrift store cowboy wear, and they'd be playing on Queen Street, and they'd be packing it out every night. Whereas our band would be empty room after empty room because our thing was over and their thing was coming up, and it all made sense to me. I was like, yeah, people are burnt on the fake ass, and I'm not going to knock any other bands, but the music industry of Toronto at that time was putting out a lot of bands that were, clones trying to find the next hit. And it wasn't rootsy. And that first Blue Rodeo record, when it came out, was kind of, what is this? But they were coming out of a scene that already existed on Queen Street and up at the Holiday on Bloor, which became the Reverb, and all these places around town. But really, the Rivoli and the Horseshoe were kind of ground zero. And that was a live, thriving scene. And all the people that were chasing the big hit on radio were kind of playing a version of a fading new wave sound, the end embers of the 80s sound. And the Toronto version of that was particularly heinous because it didn't have any edge. It wasn't from the streets of London or the Chelsea in New York, or it was just like, how do we dress? How do we have a hit? Let's get into that hair. Let's put on that outfit and let's try to have a hit. So it was, it was But that's how music works. I mean, somebody gets success and everybody chases it and the clones develop. But the rodeos, it was Handsome Ned that really started playing those gigs at the Cameron House. And people saw that he was this amazing, it almost all comes out of sort of the Graham Parsons approach to country music, that it's a country rock hybrid, but it's not hard rock meets country. It's twangy for real, Anyways, that is a long story, but that transition from the new wave to the country, when Neo A4 broke up, my first real gig that was a gig did for 2 years was the Leslie Spitt Trio. And we won a Juno Award for, I think, most promising group in 91. We beat Colin's band, Crash Vegas. Nice. Thank you very much. We were that year, the crop was National Velvet, Crash Vegas, Leslie Spitt Trio, whatever. And they played, it was a little less country. They were a little bit more rocking. And they were 3 playwright actors who would busk for extra dough on the Leslie Spitt in Toronto. And so they needed a rhythm section to go out and play live. So they got me and a bass player, and they made their first record, and they had a hit off their first record. They did a cover of John Prine's Angel from Montgomery.
Yes.
And it was a great rocking cover.
Amazing.
And then when I was with them, they won a Juno, and it was my introduction to no technology, just sit down and play, kind of like when I was a teenager. And it was rootsy in a really great way. And then from there, I joined Skydiggers and made a record with them and won another Juno Award for most promising. I've never lived up to my promise. Yeah.
You're the good luck charm.
Yeah, but they were more folk rock. I mean, the Diggers had rocking moments, but there's a folk tradition that simmers through their music, whereas Leslie Spitt, it was a little bit more of a scrappy rock thing mixed with roots. And so I learned a little bit more about folk with the Diggers. And then after that, I played country music, and I went to Nashville and worked with Patricia out of Nashville, and did a lot of time in the US playing actual country music at actual country festivals and meeting the people of America that live in the middle, that have pickup trucks and gun racks, and they go to church and they listen to country music. And I learned from my bandmates what is hip country music and what is crap, because I had no idea. I had a great education from Patricia and her band. And I finally got my education, and I learned to respect the great country music. Most of it to me is from the past, but I learned what great country is. And that continues to this day. I mean, Jim and Basil and the rodeo guys, we have those country nights that we do at the Horseshoe every year now, where we play country covers all night. And it's usually great choices. Everybody brings great old country music, and we try to do it justice. And so that, I would say, it took me, I won't say how many years, but it took me many years to learn to respect country music and find the good stuff that I honestly do like. Of course, the whole time I still listen to The Cure.
Yeah.
I still love
the
Cheap Trick and the Psychedelic Furs, and I still love my British post-punk new wave. Still love the Clash.
Yeah.
Still love my Elvis Costello, but I don't have to play what I listen to, and I don't have to listen to what I play. It's just music. It's just music.
Well, this is what I'm wondering. Like, how about your playing? Like, there's quite a big difference between playing new wave music and then having to play a kind of country influenced. Well, even with Patricia, was like really country music. Like, that is a huge change, isn't it? Or is it not?
I'll let you in on my feelings of this, which some will disagree with, which is great. When I joined Patricia's band, I played the same way I played in Neo A4, because I played to a click track. And it was that era of country where I had plexiglass, in-ear monitors, a drum machine running the tempos, because they wanted the tempos to be exactly the same every night. And I would nail the click track, like play right on the money, like I was playing new wave. And by playing that way, which I thought, this isn't country at all, I won Canadian Country Music Drummer of the Year the first year I
What?
played with her at the
That's amazing.
CCMAs or whatever, which made me go, okay, it isn't that different. You're just playing country parts. Now, here's what changed is when I started playing with you and with Jim Cuddy and with this, even with the Sky Diggers and Laurie Yates, is they want a feel that is far more organic and much more like the classic country of the 50s, 60s, and all the way up to the end of the 70s, really. 50s, 60s, 70s, which is not to a click. You're not trying to play. You're trying to swing a lot more. You're trying to, and that feel to me is much closer to old Rolling Stones or even the early Beatles. You're trying to swing like Ringo and Charlie. And the great country drummers or the great session drummers that played on those country hits, a lot of those, it's always been a session town, Nashville, where the live band doesn't play on the records for the most part. A lot of those great Nashville session players, they could swing in that way in the early country. It's become a more mechanized form of music, much more of a pop music format. It's really kind of 80s rock with people with Southern accents talking about their trucks on top of almost 80s rock at this point.
Yeah.
And that's the commercial Nashville radio music, and that's a formula in itself. But the swinging, groovy, the Buckaroos and Waylon and Willie and all that stuff, that is swinging in a way not unlike Charlie Watts. And, Charlie's a big jazz guy, so he's coming over from... So, wow, what's my point here is that the feel is the thing, not so much the parts. And when I play the parts of country really stiff to a drum machine, that worked for that early 90s, mid 90s country that we were playing, because with Patricia at that point, she had a top 40 single in the US, and we were playing the big country festivals. And you would basically be playing on bills with Trisha Yearwood and the Mavericks and Vince Gill and all great bands. But it was a modern rock-based sound, a lot of that stuff. I shouldn't really lump Vince in there. Vince is kind of he has his own trip. He's one of the true greats. And I was privileged enough to watch him play at a few festivals. And we met him at a festival too. He was the nicest man and a truly great artist. But it was a really good education.
Guy too?
Pardon me?
Was he a session guy too? He was
yes.
a guitarist, yeah.
Yeah, and he was in a band called Pure Prairie League. Remember that song? It's the name of a lady's name. Won't you? Well, whatever. He had a great hit with Pure Prairie League. Then the label saw him, that he was good looking. He could sing like a bird. He plays like he's just a monster. And they gave him his own career. And around the time I was working out in Nashville, he was the reigning god. This is pre Brad Paisley, post Garth Brooks, the Garth Brooks thing was early 90s. I was there from about 94 to 98, roughly in there. So the Garth Brooks gold rush years, where Nashville really took off, was over. So I was seeing the fading Nashville a little bit, but the music was great, like Trisha Yearwood and the Mavericks. And I remember we'd play with Pam Tillis, and we would play with, and the Canadian angle on that was Michelle Wright was the big hit back then, pre Shania Twain. Shania Twain was right around the corner.
Yeah.
So
she
Patricia,
was like then.
Yeah, the lady I played with, Patricia, she was great. She had a dozen top 5 singles in Canada. Like, she was a queen of country radio in Canada, trying her hand to make it in Nashville, and took a very valiant attempt. So we would get on these giant country festivals, and I would see these, 12-piece country bands where people are barely playing anything, with pedal steel, 3 acoustic players. Vince had 2 drummers, a bass player, and they're all wicked players, but they don't play.
Playing like
they play
one
nothing.
swell.
Yes. But perfectly.
Okay, but wait, yeah, I know, perfectly at the perfect moment, at the perfect volume. No, very kind of contained and arranged and everything. But what's so interesting is to hear you talk about, Blue Rodeo being this reaction to hair bands or new wave. And then in the 80s, what is it, late 80s?
Yep.
And then this resurgence of country music, which you were part of. But then when I met you, you were playing with Jim Cuddy's solo project, and it was sort of like before anybody was really calling it this. It was like this alt country Americana, also a resurgence, even though all this music was actually happening for years and years. I mean, I remember seeing Lucinda Williams when I lived in Vancouver in the early 90s, and hardly anyone is there, and she looks like she doesn't know why she's even here in Vancouver.
Yep.
And so this music has always been here, it hasn't gone away, but it becomes this thing that rises up again, and I happen to be making music that kind of fit into that. And I was influenced most definitely by old folk recordings that had no, you don't really even know who's playing on the record, or old time fiddle music or country blues stuff. And then we made Johnstown together, which was much more kind of influenced by blues. But I love that when we added your drums, it was like huge drums, like.
We had to turn them down. We have to turn them down.
But it was excellent because it was like I mean I really believed in that thing of like the Stones making a blues record but electrified, and then you came in and you did your parts, and then I guess I'm gonna bring this to Sleepy Little Sailor because that is the name of this podcast, even though I could totally go down a rabbit hole down with you. But I'm gonna round it up into us talking about making the record, because I love talking to you about this a few weeks ago because you remember different things than I do. And so with Johnstown, you came in and I had already played everything pretty much, and we had it to a click track. And then we decided to make this record with, and I carefully selected everybody, and we all hadn't, I'd played with you and Basil, and I'd played with Luke separately and with Bob separately. And then I wanted to assemble all of you guys. And we made this record kind of from the ground up. And one of the things, so tell me about your first memory of us creating that record. It was even before we went into the studio, really.
It's one of my favorite memories was that little, Colin had secured a rehearsal room that he was sharing with Tim Thornley, now of Big Wreck. And him and Tim were working on some stuff, I think pre-producing some Big Wreck or Tim Thornley stuff. Ian Thornley. Tim Thornley's a guy, Toronto producer. Anyways, Ian Thornley. And so we went in there, and it was just you and me and Colin. Basil was still out with the rodeos on a road trip. Luke was doing his own thing. We were going to meet them in the studio later. And the cool thing I liked is almost as a reaction to going in and grafting bass and drum parts onto a pre-recorded Suzie and a click. This time we could start it directly, like from scratch, and you would play the songs on your guitar. Now, I had a whole drum set in front of me, and I didn't want to drown you out. So I'd play with brushes or blast sticks or rods or whatever. And I wouldn't even play half the kit. I would just play just a snare and a hi-hat with the odd kick, or one cymbal and a tom, and maybe a hi-hat and the odd kick. Just almost using the drum set as a percussion line to get the accents and the flow of your songs. And then, as it morphed, and we worked for, I think, a couple of days on that. I was like, okay, this will be the beat to this song. I'll play it as a full beat, but I got to stay out of the way and leave air, because I don't really know how much stuff she wants to pile on top of this. So it was quite minimal. I played very minimally, leaving room for you. And I almost like we were almost like a two-piece band. You know,
Yeah.
it was acoustic drum set, you singing. So voice, acoustic, and a drum kit. And that was the flow for a couple of days. And Colin
And
would just sort
what
of
did
sit
he
there and
do?
listen and go, okay, it should shift gears there. Well, doing the producer pre-production
Yeah.
thing, like let's make the chorus, get to the chorus sooner, or let's make that a longer section for a solo, or all the great suggestions he always comes up with.
Mm-hmm.
Then did Basil show up? Eventually, he showed up
He
at that
did.
rehearsal room.
Yeah, he did. I remember now that you're right, that he couldn't arrive until a few days later or a day later. And maybe that was kind of for an
The rodeos were probably busy.
advantage. Yeah, they were busy, but also it was probably an advantage that we could just really focus on the drums. Sorry,
And
Basil.
well, it was more about trying to get the dynamics,
Yeah,
the
the
dynamic
dynamics.
flow. Because when Basil showed up, he loved a lot of what we did, but there was a good kick in the ass from him too, where if something was to his ear maybe a little too precious, he'd say, "Nah,
Mm,
let's just fucking play it. Let's just
yeah.
let's just go bass drums, a groove, and give Susie something to sit on top of that's a little more solid." And some of the songs needed that.
Mm-hmm.
And Basil's always a great arranger. Like
Mm-hmm.
every record I've made with him, people will discuss ideas for how a song is going. And then at a certain point, he will stay very quiet. At some point, he'll go, maybe we should try this. And everybody will go, yep. Because he just listens and holds his tongue until he knows he's got a good suggestion. He doesn't just say something for the sake of mucking it up. And he has a great ear for arrangement. And he's always been a serious arranger on every record I've ever made with him.
Mm-hmm.
And on your record, when he came in later, it added another dimension. But I think, some of the aesthetic that we'd established at the very beginning, when it was just the two of us,
Mm-hmm.
some of that made it all the way through, because
Mm-hmm.
Luke also recognized that I should just go chuck on these verses, or Luke was very good at preserving space.
Yeah.
And then when it came time for him to fill the space, he always had the perfect tone and the perfect part. And it was always not too slick, or
Mm-hmm.
like Luke is a master musician who could be Johnny
Mm-hmm.
Slick session guy if he wants. If somebody said to him, we want something really LA, Luke, and it's got to be just like all the cats are doing, and he could do that. But if you say to him, we want something really spiky and Mark Ribot like, or
Yeah.
something like you'd hear on a Lucinda Williams record that's really from out of the swamp, that's all in his range too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I thought he brought that to the record. That other end, the spikier, swampier, not entirely slick part,
Mm-hmm.
was fantastic, because
Mm-hmm.
he always finds the right tone with which to express that kind of playing.
Yeah.
And then Packwood would be like on I Got Dreams to Remember. Okay, you're doing a soul tune, you're doing Otis. I'm just playing as simple as I can, like doing my Al Jackson impersonation, and Basil's laying it down. Luke is playing some really cool toned, different guitar than Stax would have been, but
Mm-hmm.
not too far outside the aesthetic. But then Packwood would go, this needs a absolutely tasty 1966 organ flourish, and he just nails it.
Oh yeah.
And suddenly you're like, yes, it's this great soul song. And Susie's giving it her own spin, but he would take you to the heart of the original version so that you could really feel the contrast between what we were doing and what that song was back in the 60s. And Bob would just bring that in because he's an expert at so many things.
But
Anyways,
he's like a
picked
guy
well.
who brought the history. I mean, everybody had a history. I think that's really cool, is that you came from this new wave sort of more punk rock thing, and that's where I was living in for a long time in my youth. And so it was great to have a roots drummer who totally understood that part of musical history. And one of the things I want to ask you is that, what was I mean, if you're a session guy, what usually happens during the session? What happens? You had this really hilarious story a few weeks ago about like what usually happens when you're the drummer on a session that
Well,
the like endless chasing of the demo or whatever it is.
well, I always look at it like I'm not a true session player in that I had my own band for years.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're a guy who perhaps played in a couple cover bands as a teenager and does a few bar gigs to make $100 here and there, but you make your living in the studios. This doesn't exist barely anymore, but when that existed, those guys were really good at just shutting up and doing exactly what is required to get the check, and not really digging too deep on the artist as to what the artist wants, unless the artist has suggestions, and then you do exactly as the artist wants. Now, some artists, if you can read the room, they seem to be hiring you because they want you to generate a few ideas. They want your opinion. Now, if you're a guy from your own band, that's very easy for you to do because you're probably a cynical jackass who hated everything but his own band. And, because that's the way bands have to be. Bands have to be gangs against the world, right?
Right.
And so it's very easy to leap in and tell your artist that you're working for in a session, maybe we should do it this way, to which, if you've read the room right, they'll say, that's interesting. If you read the room wrong, they'll say, why don't you just shut up and play the drums? But to me, there's a difference between, like Chad Smith of the Chili Peppers played on a Dixie Chicks record. He'd already been in the Chili Peppers for 100 years, and he was known as, but he played this beautiful rootsy drumming on that the Dixie Chicks record that won the Grammy. That proved to me that no matter how polluted you are by being in your own band with your gang members, you can go in there and be a professional session guy. But the more pure professional session guys, like the Toronto guys that I knew and some of the Nashville guys I knew, they've never had a lot of them have never had a band with its own record deal. They went to music school or they jobbed around and eventually were good enough to find their way into the studio. So they tend to just do what's required without making a lot of suggestions. Often the perfect part. That's why you hire these guys. I think with you weren't trying to make a commercial product for the radio. You were just trying to express the best version of those songs that you could do. And you said, I'm going to get Basil, and I've already been playing live with Joel and Basil, and I've known Luke forever, and I love Bob's playing, and I've known him for a while. And I think, and you chose very wisely. You didn't really know when you got us together what kind of chemistry it would be, but you knew that we had all done enough sessions that we could probably behave ourselves good enough and wait to see how the chemistry would work out. And it did. And, any players with any degree of, that have been around for a while, that have a bit of a track record, they're not necessarily older. Like Luke had done 1 billion gigs by the time he was 11, I'm sure. He was a wonder child in a way.
Yeah.
And same with Basil. Basil was in country bands at 14, right? But for me, I spent so long in my own band trying to make it. I didn't even have to play a shuffle until 1990, after 9 years in my own band. I was so busy chasing the helicopter beats and trying to nail the drum machine sequence that by the time you hired me to play that, I had only had a few years of the rootsy thing. And I luckily enough found a way to play a shuffle. And I found I did have an affinity for playing the kind of style you needed. That I was doing your gig as a session in a sense, but it felt more like I was joining a band because we had already been a band with you and me and Baz and I think Bryson later. So it's more like you were augmenting your tiny little band with some ringers that you knew would work with us, and it worked out perfectly. So it was in between a session and a band. Johnstown felt more like a session because Basil was nice enough to say, I know this girl. She's incredible. She's one of the best songwriters I've ever heard. You would be privileged to play with her. And I was always like, yes, Baz, because Baz knows. And when I got there and met you and I heard the Johnstown songs, I was like, holy shit, this stuff's heavy. I don't want to fuck this record up. So I just put my head down, and I barely got to know you back then. It was more just.
Well, we were getting you in like concentrated because you did like 10 songs or whatever it was.
2 or 3 days.
Short time. Yeah.
But Johnstown was more like, I know her and we've been on the road together. And I think I know what this song will need. And it was easier because I knew your music a lot more. And we'd played all those Johnstown songs live.
Yeah.
But these songs were not murder ballads. Mm-hmm. You were exploring a lot more light and shade. Like you had darkness, but a lot of light. And, if Sleepy Little Sailor to me, Johnstown is in a wood paneled room. Sleepy Little Sailor has windows everywhere out to possibly the sea or a forest. Light comes into it more, but there are shadows in the corners,
Yeah.
And this is really pretentious because what does this have to do with drumming? Absolutely nothing, possibly. But when you finish the record and I got the mixes and I listened to it, I found it a great listen over the course of it because the songs aren't all the same. You aren't, you're not trying to do a commercial thing where I'm Oh Susanna, it is alt country, it is Lucinda Williams style alt country, and that's our market. And the first single's called Car Wheels on a Semi-Gravel Truck Stop Road. No, you just said it wasn't alt country in a sense of, later on when I was with Kathleen, we would play gigs with Wilco or more of the alt country darlings. We would be on festival bills with some of these alt country darlings. And there was, like any music, it became codified. Alt country became a set of moves as much as hair metal became a set of moves. Basil educated me in it, get that first Sun Volt record. Then you got to check out the Uncle Tupelo and all great advice and all true. But with you, people could classify you as alt country, but it was really more of an art folk country, dare I say some bluesiness. Like you created your own world with that record. It was very tough to classify. And to me, those are the greatest records, and the greatest artists are like Neil Young or Prince. They've made such disparate sounds, but when you listen to their records, you're entering their world. And that's what I thought you did on Sleepy Little Sailor. You created a landscape and a world to get into. The songs are of different styles. And there is the connecting line of Colin's production, which is fairly minimal, but with great detail, and but that's why I like you as an artist so much, is you're not saying I'm chasing this bag of music. It's more, I'm trying to show you people my world. And the best artists create a world and they invite the listener in. And that's most of my favorite artists have that. Like, this Sleepy Little Sailor has nothing to do with The Cure. But the thing I like about The Cure is you go into Robert Smith's world, and sure, it's lipstick and hair and but it's as much as Neil Young or Prince, you're entering his world. And so many artists, they're just people with record deals chasing a hit, and they don't really have a point of view, and they don't really have a world. They're just making records in an attempt to make a living and or have a hit. And they'll say, oh yeah, that last record was sort of kind of a new wave bossa nova, but now it's kind of a synth dance thing. And you're like, why? And it's because they're just following what's hot. Whereas you didn't. You've always made your own record, and Sleepy Little Sailor was, to me, very broad. There's some really quiet, beautiful things where, I think I put a chain on a hi-hat rod without a top cymbal. And for the backbeat, I was dropping the chain onto the bottom hi-hat. And you just, and so the backbeat is like, and it's so quiet. And like it would never get heard at most recordings. But Colin said, that's a great sound. And the song is so quiet and so delicate that works. And other songs like River Blue, I'm just playing a beat and we're slamming it, and so you're singing hard, and those are both on the same record.
Yeah.
That is great.
Thanks, Joel. That is a really huge compliment.
It's your record. I just play drums on it,
I mean, this is the thing that was so wonderful about it, and I was that it was so delicate, and you guys really, but it wasn't tentative in what you guys were doing. It was like really with intention, and we are going to create this delicate piece of gauze or something.
But
and
it's strong.
It's going to float around. But yeah, there's this power to it, and so much space and air. And it was a pleasure to make it with you and to go on tour with you as well. I mean, there's so many things we could talk about. We're almost at an hour, and I'm trying to keep these discussions sort of under the hour. And so last night we talked for 2 hours, just the two of us doing our sound check here. And it was one of those things where I was like, yeah, we're just going to check in for 5 minutes and then, okay, I'll see you tomorrow and we'll have a talk. But no, last night we talked for 2 hours. So you guys, that was the secret podcast because it was super gossipy.
Too racy for
that you cannot know unless you, corner me or something. I'll probably tell you everything if you see me live ever again. But thanks, Joel. And I mean, one of the coolest things, I'm just going to leave you in with this thing. One of the coolest afternoons I spent was with you, and we weren't even on tour. I think we may have been rehearsing or something. I don't even know. But we went to Long and McQuaid. The thing about me is that I've never really got, like when I was younger, I listened to music with drums, but I always so focused on the singing.
Yes.
That I would just feel the drums and bass in the whole band, but I wouldn't really understand what they did. And so it's really a privilege to have played with some of the most amazing musicians, you and Luke and Bob and Basil, like incredibly talented people. And from you guys, I learned so much about what a band does. And one day we were on Bloor Street at Long and McQuaid, and you said, I love gear. I got to go and check out the cymbals. And we go into the room that's sealed off so that you can test the cymbals, and you put the cymbal, you go, this is what you do. Because I was like, what are drums for anyway? and you're like, this is the cymbal, and you put it on the stick, and you hit it with the other stick or your hand, and then you can listen to it, and you go, listen to that. See that? That's kind of a dark sound. And that would sound good on your stuff. But you put on this cymbal and you hit that, and see, it's kind of bright and shimmery, and that would be great with a pop band. And so you gave me this cool education on what drums actually did instead of just being like some loud cacophony. And it's so ironic now, like I'm married to a drummer. But yeah, it's just I just learned so much by hanging out with you guys. Like I was really green, and you guys had so much respect for what I was doing. And yet I learned so much from
Suzie, it's way harder to write a great song than to just progress as a player. I honestly believe that. You're saying we kind of taught you a little bit about how to be in a band. A band is useless without songs. So people that are songwriters, especially, let's say a folk art, like, generally a person with an acoustic guitar trying to write good songs. If they come up with something good, that's amazing. If they come up with something great, that is awe-inspiring. I know a million great players, not a million, but let's the phrase a million. I know many great players, and most great players can't write their way out of a wet paper bag. There are a few amazing artists that, you buy their records, like let's say Prince, where he was not only a great songwriter, but he could play all the instruments. He was kind of a freak show.
Mm-hmm.
But with you, there's never a need to belittle, in a sense. Like, I'm not saying you were belittling. I mean, I am saying this, that you were just saying, I was so green. And yeah, well, of course you were green to maybe being a band member, because you were learning the awe-inspiring, incredibly difficult task of writing great songs. And I mean, that is kind of magic meets witchcraft meets, like, there is a certain amount of hard craftsmanship where you just say, what key are we in? Yeah, this change sounds good against this.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I need some lyrics. Broccoli, chopping broccoli, like, there's that guy. But to actually come up with something that people want to listen to over and over again, your end of it is the whole thing, really. Because with your songs, if you got a crap band together and you couldn't afford a decent studio, and you just got some friends of yours together that could barely play, but they played your songs and you recorded it fairly badly, it would still be good. When you when you assemble players who you like and we all work together, I think we make your songs even better.
Mm-hmm.
But from where they are as your song to where they would be with a bunch of hacks to where we brought it, it's only the next no, because I think I was telling you that the other thing we talked about, that I've been the guy that tweaks up the demos and did the master, and I've also been the guy that did the demos, watching a session great take my demo and tweak that up to a master. It really all just starts with, was it a good song? Mm-hmm. That's what you do.
Thank you. That's it. I just set you up to say all these beautiful things about me. I owe you $5.
Okay, you got it. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, it was so nice to have you. Thank you. And thank you to everybody who's joining us. Does anybody have any last minute requests or comments? Or do you want to just... Amazing, guys. Love this series. Stories are great. Yeah, we're really thankful that you guys are here with us. And eventually I'm going to catch up with Bob Packwood. He's elusive and he wants to do this interview. So, but it might not be on schedule. So just stay tuned. And if you missed the other conversations, you can find them on YouTube.
YouTube? What's that?
Yes. What is YouTube?
What is that new?
So
I've got to go. I've got to go tweak my MySpace page.
Exactly. Yes. I'll go find you. What is it? I'll nudge you or poke you or something.
I'm nearly 60.
I know. Okay. Love you so much, Joel.
Take care.
Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.